Welcome to the lie that one curriculum fits all children. Much like the Highlander, the system says there can only be one. And the lie is this, that one chosen curriculum will cover all the bases for educating the children in a classroom or program. And that any fallout from children not connecting to that curriculum is somehow the fault of the educator or the child. We know that's BS. When we talk about curriculum here, we are talking about box curriculum, scripted curriculum, scope and sequence pacing guides, and the intense pressure that staying on pace is the only way to deliver quality. Let me tell you, I know these pressures very well. As a newer educator, I was told my schedule needed to be posted, so inspectors could know where I was at any point in the day if they walked in. And all I could think was, what if the kids don't want to follow the schedule that day? What if the conversation goes deeper? What if the play is richer? What if something real is happening? But suddenly, I was struck with this idea that not sticking to the schedule on the wall meant that I was lacking quality, that deviation meant deficiency. So then I had to ask myself, what do I do if the children don't fit the script? What do I do if I don't fit the script? And we all know what happens. Okay, I already don't fit the script, right? But children disengage, behaviors increase, everyone gets bored, the creativity gets sucked out of the room. Scripts are not evil. That's no one's saying that. They can be helpful as guides, but what happened to building the environment around the children, around their personalities as a group, around their interests, around who they are as individuals? How did early childhood education get to a place where educators are not trusted enough to create environments that best serve the children in front of them? When did curriculum stop being a tool and start being a script? Because the weight of choosing the right curriculum is heavy, and often it doesn't allow the individual child to shine. That is the lie. That one curriculum, if implemented with fidelity, will serve all children equally. And if it doesn't, the assumption is not that the curriculum failed. The assumption is that the educator did. To understand how we got here, we have to go back further than most people expect. The idea that one size fits all in curriculum did not appear overnight. In fact, it traces back to the 1800s as schools began to formalize, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Early education started from shifting away from village-based care and into structured institutions. So Froebel's kindergartens were often pointed to as some of the first structured programs designed specifically for young children. Teacher-guided play, organized materials, intentional learning experiences. So now this was not inherently harmful, but it marked a shift. Education for young children began to move from community-based and relational to something that could be designed, organized, studied. Ooh. As the 20th century approached, developmental science and institutional research began shaping the field heavily. Standards for professionals began to emerge. Teaching was becoming something that could be defined. And once you define a profession, what you do? You try to measure it. And that is where curriculum began to shift. If educators were going to be assessed, there had to be a way to determine effectiveness. Curriculum slowly became one of the tools used to evaluate whether teachers were doing their jobs correctly. But for curriculum to function as an evaluation tool, it had to be aligned. It had to be delivered consistently. Because if it is not the same, how do you determine whether the materials are effective or whether the teacher is effective? And you hear this a lot during my series because this is what the education field was built on: sameness. Standardizing curriculum meant including learning expectations, program standards, workforce standards, assessment, alignment, accountability structures. I mean, this is a lot to ask for a curriculum. As early childhood education became more organized, so did the expected outcomes. And this is where something subtle but powerful happened. Care and education began to separate. The 19th century becomes ground zero for formalized early childhood education, for the gradual removal of care from what was considered real education. Then the industrial period took care of the rest. I talked about that before. The U.S. began to standardize the school system based on the industrial model. Y'all can't forget that. Education starts to mirror factories: efficiency, uniform pacing, measurable outcomes. School readiness became the goal. As the United States began competing on a global scale, education became tied to competitiveness. And to compete, you have to measure. You have to measure what the children are being taught and how they are being taught. And as measurement became the focus, the academic pushdown became more pronounced over time. And we're going to talk more about academic pushdown later. Organizations like NAEYC formed in 1926, and it entered the conversation as professional standards and classroom expectations became more formalized. At the same time, institutions like Bank Street emphasized something critical. You cannot design curriculum without understanding the child. Development and curriculum must go hand in hand. That was the backbone of the field. But here's where tensions began. As the system grew larger and more programs needed oversight, alignment became easier than flexibility. It is easier to monitor something that looks the same everywhere. It is easier to measure something that moves at the same pace everywhere. And slowly, curriculum became less about responding to the children in front of you and more about ensuring alignment across systems. When alignment becomes the goal, deviation starts to look like inconsistency. Inconsistency starts to look like weak instruction. And one size begins to look safer than flexibility. That is how we got here. And that connection becomes even clearer in the early 1990s. In 1990, the National Education Goals Panel brought early education leaders together to discuss readiness and measurement. Even then, readiness and measurable outcomes were becoming central to national education goals. From that point forward, federal initiatives reinforced the idea that school readiness and measurable standards should be embedded in early education. And we're going to talk about why in another episode. So one example is the 2002 Good Start, Grow Smart initiative. Programs like Head Start were required to demonstrate outcomes more clearly in order to maintain federal funding. Systems of compliance and accountability became increasingly structured, and curriculum became one of the primary tools for demonstrating that experts' expectations were being met. Because if funding requires measurable outcomes, and measurable outcomes require alignment, then curriculum becomes the structure that proves that alignment. At the same time, curriculum development became a major sector within the field. You see these companies. Education companies expanded rapidly, creating packaged and scripted curriculum models designed to meet funding expectations and accountability standards. Curriculum was no longer just a guide. It became a mechanism for compliance. So, how does this connect to the lie that one size fits all? The issue is not that curriculum exists. The issue is how curriculum is used. When curriculum is treated as something that must be implemented with strict fidelity, regardless of the children in the room, it shifts from being a tool to being a script. And that is where the lie takes hold. Scripted curricula takes many forms. Some include literal speaking scripts. Others map out the entire day down to the minute. And while these models have existed since the late 1800s, they became more popular as funding became tied to measurable outcomes. When funding is attached to outcomes, programs must demonstrate learning gains. And to demonstrate those gains, systems need consistency. But here's the impact. Research shows that while following intended activities can support outcomes, strict adherence to scripted language does not necessarily produce stronger results than flexible implementation. Educators who adapt delivery while maintaining learning goals are not reducing effectiveness. And highly scripted programs can limit something so critical: professional judgment. When every word of an educator is predetermined, educators have less space to respond in real time. This can cause issues when you're trying to handle behaviors. At the same time, the research on fully scripted curriculums and long-term outcomes, it's still developing. There is no consistent evidence showing that strict adherence is universally better for young children, which means the responsibility still sits with the educators. It is still our role to evaluate how curriculums are used, to make decisions that serve the children in front of us, not just the expectations tied to funding. So we have to ask, and I know I asked a lot of questions, if curriculum is shaped to meet funding expectations and oversight requirements, can we honestly say that one-size-fits-all models are always designed with children at the center? Thank you for tuning in to another episode of At Its Roots, Exploring America's Commitment to Childcare. I will see you next episode.